Dear Mr. Timkins, I'm writing you because I think it's important that we discuss Billy's recent behaviour in class. I have tried contacting you over the phone on several occasions, but I've been unsuccessful in getting through. I would appreciate it if you could get in touch with me to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. Let me start off by saying that Billy is a very bright young man. He's truly gifted across the board. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the boy has one of the most impressive scientific minds I've seen in years, especially when it comes to chemistry and biology. He may only be 11, but he has more knowledge in these areas than plenty of adults I know. Whatever work you've been doing with him outside the classroom, it's clearly paid off in that respect. I'm also conscious that the circumstances at home have not been easy for any of you recently. I'm aware that Billy's grandfather passed away a few months back. It must be a very difficult time, so please do accept my sincere condolences. And I know that I wouldn't be contacting you if I didn't deem the matter an urgent one. As long as I've known him, Billy has kept to himself. He's always been one of those children who are just as happy, if not happier, in their own company, eating by himself at lunchtime, playing on his own. He's always struck me as something of a shy boy. He has never struck me, up until the past few weeks, as a violent one. But recently, there have been causes for concern. 3 incidents in particular that I wanted to address with you. We can discuss these in more detail when you come in, but I've outlined them below so you understand the seriousness of the situation. The first incident took place a couple of weeks ago. Billy had a falling out with another boy in the playground. I don't know what the disagreement was about, and neither boy will tell me. But another little girl was playing nearby, and she tells me she heard your son say to the other young man, "If you don't back off, my granddad will get you. He knows how to do magic. He can make you disappear." Those exact words. Now, I'm aware that these are very difficult circumstances. Billy is almost certainly still grieving for his grandfather, and I know grief can often present itself in unusual ways. But despite this, I cannot completely excuse Billy. I'm told the other boy was quite distressed, and we cannot tolerate threatening language like that in our school. The second incident took place last week. I was having a chat with Billy after class, because he wanted to talk through his math homework with me, make sure he understood it. As you can probably imagine, this isn't a common occurrence with the children in my class, so I was more than happy to help. But as he was reaching into his rucksack to get his textbook, a tin fell out. Not the pencil case he always has on his desk, but a plain red tin I hadn't seen before. When it fell out of his rucksack, it landed on the ground and broke open. There were insects inside it. Dead, dismembered insects. Flies with their wings removed, a chopped up worm, a spider with half its legs pulled off, which still seemed to be alive, and tried crawling away across the carpet. The only other thing in the tin besides the insects was a small pair of tweezers. Now, I want you to know, Billy gave me an explanation for all this. He told me the bugs were part of an experiment. He said he'd been trying to teach himself about anatomies, so he'd been collecting some insects to dissect. I asked him why the spider was still alive, if that was the case, but he told me he thought it had been dead when he was, quote, operating on it. Said it must have gone into shock. If I'm honest, I'm not sure what to believe. As I'm sure you can appreciate, I found the whole thing rather disturbing, and it's even more troubling in light of the final matter I want to discuss with you. This last incident took place yesterday. It involved another little girl in Billy's class called Annabelle. Mrs. Herbert, our teaching assistant, was the one who found them. Billy and Annabelle were in the far corner of the school field during lunch, behind some bushes. Mrs. Herbert was patrolling the area, she told me, when she heard screams. She went to investigate, and when she walked around those bushes, she found Billy standing over the little girl. Annabelle had tears running down her face. Mrs. Herbert said she had her arms raised over her head as if to defend herself, and in Billy's hands were a pair of silver tweezers, the same pair I'd seen fall out of his bag last week. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you here, Mr. Timkins. When Mrs. Herbert told me this, I wanted to suspend Billy on the spot. I wanted him gone. Our school has a zero tolerance policy when it comes to bullying. The problem is, Mrs. Herbert didn't actually see your son do anything to the girl, and both children insist that they were only playing. I spoke to them both separately, and they had the same exact story. They were playing at being doctors, and Billy was pretending to operate on Annabelle. When I asked her why she'd been crying if that was the case, she clammed up. Wouldn't say anything else to me at all. I did notice that she had a red patch on the back of her head, however, a bald spot that had begun to scab over. If I had to guess, Mr. Timkins, I'd say your son was using those tweezers to pull the hairs out of her scalp. The only other bit of information I have is something Mrs. Herbert told me. Something the girl apparently said shortly after Mrs. Herbert found them both. Something she let slip while she was still upset. Mrs. Herbert was comforting her, telling the girl she could tell her anything she wanted, and Annabelle turned to her and said, "I can't say anything bad about Billy, Mrs. Herbert, or he'll make it worse. His granddad's a ghost. He'll come through my window and get me while I'm sleeping." Again, that's a direct quote. Mrs. Herbert tried to get more out of her, but she wouldn't say anything else. Anyway, I apologise for the long letter, Mr. Timkins. I know the past few months can't have been easy. I'm also aware that the change in Billy's behaviour is very likely linked to his recent bereavement, especially given what the other children have said about his grandfather. I'm sure you can now see why it's crucial that we speak as soon as possible. The school wants to support Billy as much as we can, but in the meantime, we simply cannot have him threatening or hurting other students. I do hope you'll contact me on the number below as soon as you receive this, so we can arrange an appointment and get to the bottom of the matter. Yours sincerely, Mr. Hartford, Head of Year 6. Just as I finished reading that letter, I heard the front door of the house snick shut. I glanced at my watch. Billy. It was Billy home from school. The letter had me feeling very anxious, so I decided to waste no time. I marched to the front of the house, planning to confront him straight away. Billy was unslinging his rucksack when I entered the hallway. He glanced up at me, and I saw his eyes widened when he noticed the look on my face. I thrust the letter in front of him. "I just got this from your teacher, Mr. Hartford," I said. "I want you to read it, and then I want you to explain yourself." Billy stared down at the letter. A lock of black hair from his fringe had fallen in front of his eyes, and he swept it aside with a shaking hand. The shaking only got worse as he read what his teacher had written. "Well?" I demanded a few minutes later. Billy looked at the ground, refusing to meet my eyes. He didn't say anything. "Right," I said. "Come with me." I took Billy's arm and led him through the house, chastising him as I went. "The thing you need to understand, young man, is that when you act out in school, it doesn't just affect you." We were walking through the dining room now, en route to a little hallway at the back of the house. It risks affecting our entire family. We entered the hallway and paused beside a closed door. I stared at Billy, who was looking up at me with frightened eyes. Well, what do you have to say for yourself? Despite the fear in his face, Billy met my gaze. I'm sorry, Dad, he sputtered. I'm really sorry. I saw that his eyes had started glistening with tears. In that moment, he didn't look violent or capable of hurting anyone. He looked like a little boy. And just like that, I knew I couldn't be angry with him. Tensing my whole body, I pulled open the door we were standing beside. The door to the basement. All at once, the hallway was filled with the sound of high-pitched screams. The noise made me feel ill. I found myself reflecting, almost absently, what an efficient job the builders did with the soundproofing down there. Really thorough. I told them, at the time, Billy would be using the room to practice his drumming. Said we didn't want any noise whatsoever to escape. They obviously listened. Look, Billy, I said. I know how much you miss your granddad, and you know what a special man he was, don't you? Billy nodded. And you know that the special instructions he left for us have to be followed very carefully, right? Billy nodded again. I know, Dad, he said. That's why I've been doing my best at practice, because I want to help. He stared up at me with a bright-eyed excitement. It did nothing to help the nausea in my stomach. Billy's only a kid. He's only young. Involving him in all this was the last thing I ever wanted to do. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes the alternatives are worse. The old man was very clear in the instructions he left behind. If the whole family isn't in on it, it won't work. And if the whole family doesn't try and make it work, he'll know. Oh yes, he always knows. The first time I went down to the basement, I left Billy behind. Thought it wouldn't matter. But that night he came to me while I slept. Visited me. I dreamt I was trapped in bed with my arms pinned at my sides, and he was looming over me, watching. He didn't say anything, just pointed a finger at the photo of Billy on my bedside table. The message was clear enough. If you don't do exactly what I ask, it won't be you that suffers. It'll be your son. Now I reached down and ruffled Billy's hair with a trembling hand. In the basement below us, the screams grew louder. I know you only want to help, I whispered. I know you want to see your grandpa again. But part of helping is making sure we keep what we're doing here a secret too. Do you understand that? Billy looked down at the floor and nodded for a third time, shoulders slumped. Right then, I didn't know what was worse. The fact that I had no choice but to involve him, or the fact he seemed to want to be involved. The fact that sometimes, when he looked at me in a certain light, I saw traces of his granddad in him. I'll tell you what, I said after a moment. If you promise me you'll start behaving in school, I'll let you choose the best parts on this one. How does that sound? You're still a bit too little to help with the operation, but that doesn't mean you can't be useful. Billy stared up at me with wide eyes. Really, Dad? You sure? I nodded at him, forced myself to smile, felt the nausea in my stomach roll and churn. Billy is a good kid. I know he's a good kid. All I really want to do is protect him. I spent the last 11 years of my life trying to do just that, and 3 months ago, I thought I'd succeeded. 3 months ago, when his grandpa had a heart attack, I thought the nightmare was finally over. But then I found the instructions he'd left behind for us. I started seeing him in my nightmares, and I realized it wasn't really over at all. Now I watched as Billy ran over to the top of the basement steps. He paused and grinned back at me. "I know 2 kids in my class who lost their granddads as well," he said suddenly. "They're both sad because they'll never get to see him again. But I'm not sad, Dad. I'm lucky. We both are." He turned and ran down the steps. I followed after him, shut the door firmly behind us. The screams were louder than ever now, and Billy's next words, which echoed back to me up the staircase, were almost lost in the noise. "Only a couple more bits and pieces to go now," he shouted. "Then I'll have a brand new granddad." People have always wondered how I've been able to live in such an isolated place. It mostly consists of dense forests and marshlands sprouting up around a vast lake that's considered a local beauty spot. The truth is, I've always preferred how isolated it is from the rest of the world and surrounding tranquility. I've always loved taking walks around those parts. The gentle rustle of the wind through the shivering reeds and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet seemed to wash away the stress of the daily commute to work. It almost seemed like it existed separately from the rest of the world, my own private dimension. It had been raining heavily that summer, and I found myself aching to get back to my daily routine. My dog, Bailey, had been just as eager, scratching and whining at the front door. Being a border collie, she lived to roam the open green, which made her a perfect companion for me. On the first clear day, we had both left that morning without a single hesitation. The scent of wet leaves on the misting air filled my nostrils. Bailey pushed on ahead, her tongue lolled out and happily panting. I had to jog just to keep up with her as she tugged at a leash. We had taken our usual route around the lake, through the bog, half hidden by reeds. Flies buzzed lazily over our heads under the warming sun, casting stretching shadows of the thin trees that plotted the ground. Moss clung to their dark brown trunks, climbing toward their branches. The squelching ground beneath us half soaked into my shoes, but I didn't care. I just felt so alive. A low rustle through the thicket made Bailey go rigid in her step, ears pricking upward as she caught the scent of something, probably a rabbit. She turned to me, her big brown eyes wide and pleading. I laughed. "Okay, girl," I told her, clipping off her leash. "Go right on ahead." She disappeared as a black and white blur through the surrounding grasses. The white tip of her tail sticking upwards was the only sign of her for the next few minutes, until it too was swallowed up into the towering green, leaving only some rustles, splashes, and the occasional bark. I stood there, watching and arching my back towards the warm sunlight that streaked through the disappearing grey clouds. It felt like forever since I had felt it on my skin. It had been a few minutes of complete relaxation when I noticed the silence. It was something I had long become used to, but this one was different. There were no birds chirping in the trees or patter of rabbits' feet. Bailey's bark seemed to have been swallowed up by it. "Bailey," I called out, my heart already pounded with anxiety. Nothing. "Here, girl," I whistled. Still nothing. My stomach knotted. Bailey was my best friend. I had her for 3 years. I loved her. Even just the thought that something might have happened to her was like a knife twisting into me. I rushed forwards, peeling back the plants and calling her name. A low rustle silenced the growing worry inside of me. My heart leapt. God, you really scared me there. As my eyes adjusted to the small form paddling through the shallow end of the lake, the thought rooted me to the spot. It wasn't Bailey. I had no idea what it was. Its small, pale form skimmed effortlessly through the water, barely making a ripple. The assumption that it was a fish was thrown out when it hoisted itself onto the dry banks, shaking itself dry. Its skin was neither scaly nor covered in fur. Instead, a thick, sickly grey that bulged out with warts, not unlike a toad. Its body shone slick with water in the overhead sunlight. Its massive head that bobbed down as it dragged itself around on its tiny limbs. A careless stumble alerted it to my presence. It turned around, and the breath froze inside my body. Pure black stared back at me. There was no iris or sclera to be seen. Its eyes were huge, taking up almost 2/3 of its skull, and almost devoid of light. Underneath were 2 tiny holes and a thin, almost invisible line that composed the mouth and nose. In all my time living here, I'd become acquainted to the local wildlife: birds, frogs, badgers, voles, and even the occasional deer. But it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Yet, there was something unnervingly familiar about it. It looked like a baby. I remembered the vague, dusty science lessons when my class had been shown one developing, amidst barely muffled giggles and whispers. Aside from the obvious inhuman features, it was almost identical. The oversized head, the big eyes, and the underdeveloped limbs. It blinked, straining its neck under the weight of its bulbous skull to look up at me, its mouth expanding into a toothless, gaping grin, cooing as it crawled over. I just stood there, my rational mind trying to process the abnormal sight in front of me, if it was even real. I jolted as I felt a sudden pressure on the toe of my shoe. I looked down to see the creature chewing on it, a pearly string of drool slicking the mud-encrusted leather. The creature gaped up with another vacant smile. If it hadn't been for those pitch-black, soulless eyes that seemed to be trained on my slightest breath, I would have called it cute. As grotesque as it was, I felt a sudden compulsion to pick it up and rock it in my arms. I didn't know if it was centuries of human instinct encoded in me, or just pity for how misshapen it was. But every cell in my body seemed to be pushing for it, despite the fear wavering through my body. There was more rustling coming from a patch of dense reeds close to where the creature and I was. I saw a flash of peeking black before 2 more tiny heads poked through. Another submerged up from the still surface of the lake. Soon, it had been joined by 5 more identical creatures. They stared up curiously at my new, alien presence, though, unlike the bolder one, they seemed to be keeping their distance, half hidden in the bogland, emitting high-pitched chirps and gurgles. Bailey had been pushed to the back of my mind, though ever present. I craned around the tiny thing, trying my best not to step on it as my eyes scanned for any distinctive movement amongst the plants. I wondered whether she had encountered one and chased it off into the distance, thinking it was a rabbit. Looking down at their stubby appendages, I doubted any of them would get very far. I winced at the thought, hoping that she hadn't killed one of them. Bailey didn't have a bad bone in her body, but she never realized her own strength, especially when it came to things smaller than her. I sucked in a breath, fingers clenching at my sides. Lifting my foot slightly, I managed to slide the creature off without harming it and knelt beside it until its head was just inches away from mine. Without even understanding what I was doing, my hands were already around its sides, hoisting it into the air. It kicked its chubby legs in glee at the sudden contact, tiny hands pawing at the air, trying to reach my face. Its squealing rose to a near inaudible pitch, wearing a wide smile. I soon found myself forgetting my fear, lulled by the soft sounds it was making, and found myself smiling at its antics. It looked at me as if I was the most amazing thing it had ever seen in its life, the same way Bailey always did. It possessed that unconditional adoration that only children and animals are capable of. It needed me. The moment was so consuming that I barely even registered something floating across the water. I found myself prepared to dismiss it as a lily pad until I looked closer. I only saw the bloody scraps of black fur when it was already too late. As my head turned back to the thing in my hands, I saw sharpened teeth slide out from under the shadow of its pale pink gums, where there had been none just minutes before, almost too big for its mouth, with the tattered remains of a dog collar stuck to them. Its body began to vibrate, jaws snapping. I found myself barely able to hold it back, regardless of being several times bigger than it. The sweet coos and gurgles it had been making morphed into hungry snarls and hisses. I hurled it to the ground. It bounced off the stones, lying still for a few minutes. I was sure that I had killed it until it pushed itself off the ground, dazed. Those same eyes turned towards me, glassy with tears. Its bottom lip quivered. It threw its head back with a pitiful wail. Any thought of escape or even retaliation for what it had done to Bailey instantly evaporated in my head as the sound rang through my ears. The cry of a newborn baby. My leg muscles pushed myself towards it, despite the screaming protests of my mind, my hands already reaching out to it. A scream tore itself from my throat, sent a flock of birds resting in a nearby tree scattering as I felt miniature bladed teeth embed itself into my calf, tiny fingers bruising my skin. They swarmed around my feet like a shoal of tiny humanoid piranha, clambering up my ankles towards my knees, trying to pull me to the ground. My hands helplessly groped towards the sky, my legs encased by slithering bodies. God, they were all laughing too. Scratchy, distorted imitations of real babies as they had me surrounded. My mind was a blur of panic. I would die here. They would rip me apart into nothing, just like they had done to my best friend. Memories of Bailey flashed through my mind in quick succession. Her warm, wet nose, her soft fur beneath my fingers, the clack of her paws down the wooden hallway. All the things I loved about her, that I knew I would never experience again. Rage bubbled upwards in me, spilling over. With one swift, adrenaline-fueled kick, I managed to send two flying back into the lake. Another skull fractured beneath my heel, soft brains spilling onto the ground. I broke into a stumbling run, pain rushing up from the open wound already soaking through the leg of my jeans. But I refused to stop or look back, their shrieks spilling into my ears. I didn't know how far I had run before I finally crumpled into a ditch. The blue denim of my jeans was soaked maroon from the gaping wound they had left behind. My eyes remained frozen to the gravel, too afraid to look up in case I saw them crawling towards me. When I raised my head, only to see the empty road, I fell over and wept. It's been a year now since that day. I don't go walking anymore, at least not down that path. The scar still runs over my leg, a good 2 inches in length. Though it's faded with time, the memories haven't. There hasn't been a day where Bailey hasn't occupied my mind. Her food bowl still sits in the corner of my kitchen, gathering dust. Her leash strung up over the upstairs landing, and her toys are still scattered around, ready to be played with. I didn't have the heart to get rid of them. Some days I just sit on the edge of my bed and look at them. No matter how hard I try, my thoughts always settle back to 2 painful words. If only. If only I hadn't chosen to walk around that lake. If only I hadn't let Bailey off a leash. If only we'd left when I heard the unearthly silence. Nevertheless, I tried to think of the good times we shared, to keep her memory alive. No one goes near the lake anymore. Animals have gone missing down there. A few people too. The police have searched for them, but always come up empty-handed. It's the kind of place where no one really knows how many have disappeared down there. But I know exactly where they are. I've already put the house up on the market. I'm still waiting on a buyer, but I just want to get out of this place as quickly as possible. Never did I think that I would ever want to leave this place. But here I am. Sometimes when it's dark, I can hear scuffling on my front porch. There are mornings where I find half-eaten animal parts roped around the grass. The crying of a baby seeps into my dreams with hellish shrieks, growls and whispers. Bared teeth flash out through the darkness of my mind, along with the flashing reflection of huge, shark black eyes and rippling waters encircling me, ready to descend and rip apart my flesh. There's no relief from it, not even when I wake up. Especially when I see the dozens of tiny red handprints smeared along the edges of my bedroom window. I had to go back. It had been playing on my mind for the better part of 3 decades. I tried to forget most of my time there on the farm. They were mostly horrible memories, but bits and pieces of those horrible memories kept finding their way back to me as I grew older, and they left behind a question I needed answered. Could such terrible things exist in this world? I pulled into the dirt driveway that led to the house that had long since been abandoned. The 2-story farmhouse sat on a small hill, dark and wistful. As I approached up the winding dirt driveway, I could see the dirty, rotting wood and broken shutters hanging open from dark windows. That had been my home in the 1980s. I grew up there. I had left when I was 9. It was a small farm, only one cornfield, small enough that my father could work it alone with some leased machinery. Though the land was small, he made a good amount of money from it. The farm was different. Strange. The land is ripe for growing, Dad had said to me once. He pulled a scarecrow from the equipment shed that sat next to the cornfield. There were 4 scarecrows, and Dad would set them up just after the field was sowed in growing season. They would always go up in a diamond pattern. First one he would hammer at the north end of the field, second one to the west end, third one to the east end, and fourth one to the south end. I'd always wondered why he didn't hammer in the West End scarecrow last. It was the closest to the house. But things had their order on that farm. You see, Dad said, it's special land. Real special. Yields are off the charts for the size of the field. Stop chucking that football about and listen up, Timmy. I did what he said and followed behind him closely as he dragged the scarecrow to the south end of the field. The butt of the scarecrow's stake dragged through the dirt, kicking up dust. I listened carefully to Dad. When he told you something, he only spoke kindly once. If he had to tell you twice. This is going to be your farm one day, Dad said. He drove the scarecrow's stake into the ground. So soon, not this harvest season, but maybe next, I'm going to start teaching you of how things work around here, little by little. He then hammered the top of the stake that ran up the back of the scarecrow like a spine. I flinched at each of the 4 cracking shots. When he was done, he wiped the sweat off his brow and turned to me, his brooding figure silhouetted by the now low afternoon sun. This land's good, Timmy. Real good. He smiled, with a twinge of a wild look in his eyes. You just need the right fertilizer. With that, he started back towards the house. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the scarecrow, its featureless straw face framed by a hood fashioned out of ragged burlap sack. Strange strands of straw, poking from its head, fluttered in the gentle breeze. Something in my stomach churned over. I never did like those things. I popped the trunk of my rental car, pulled out a shovel, then closed the trunk again. I looked out over the field. It was barren now, the soil untouched for decades. The equipment shed was far to my right, on the east side of the field. It was as decrepit as the house. The roof had partially caved in, and the wall planks were warped in places. An iron chain fastened by 2 heavy-duty padlocks locked the doors. I swallowed hard. I prayed they were not in there. I started toward the farmhouse. The pylons were still out. On afternoons in the growing season, when the scarecrows are in the field, and just as the sun turned orange and started its descent to the horizon, Dad would hammer in 10 4-foot wooden pylons around the house, and then take them down first thing in the morning. Each pylon had carvings on them, strange symbols that looked similar to what you'd see on a totem pole. What are those? I had asked once. I'll tell you one day. You're not ready to know yet. When the pylons and scarecrows were out, Dad had a strict rule. I had to come inside when the bottom of the sun touched the horizon. One afternoon, I'd spent too long playing outside. The sun was a big, orange semicircle peeking over the horizon line. But I did not care that day. I was having too much fun and was feeling a tad rebellious, so I played. I was chucking Hail Mary passes to myself down the driveway. In my head, I was the star quarterback of my favourite team, the New England Patriots. I always wanted to be like Dan Marino, and even though he was a Dolphin player and a division rival, he was still my favourite player. The high-flying gunslinger star quarterback that could chuck the ball 80 yards through the air. Yeah, that was me in my dreams. But reality was, I never had the talent for the game, unfortunately. But that afternoon, for a short while, with a rambunctious imagination of a 9-year-old, I was king. I heaved the ball in the air and took off underneath it. Timmy Brentwood throws the pass high and long, I shouted. I watched the wobbly spiral descend, and at full sprint, I stuck out my hands, bobbled the ball, then caught it. He's got it! He's at the 10, the 5, touchdown, Patriots! I spiked the ball into the dirt. Timothy Brentwood throws the last-second winning touchdown pass in the Super Bowl, the greatest quarterback to ever. Timmy, my father said sternly from the porch. Reality came crashing back. What's the rule? Inside before sundown. Get a move on. Anger suddenly burned in the base of my chest. He was always ordering me around. I was always doing what he wanted. Always had to listen to him. He never listened to me. I was always meek and good and followed his orders. I never got what I wanted, so he could get screwed as far as I was concerned. Just this once I wanted to play. No, I don't want to, I said, with all the misplaced confidence of a rebellious child. I want to keep playing. Dad stomped down the porch steps with purpose. He spoke through gritted teeth, his veins and tendons bulging from his neck. If I have to go out there and get you, boy. My heart froze. The confidence and anger melted away as quickly as it came. I was only scared now. I started back into the house, running past the pylons Dad had erected earlier in the afternoon. At the base of the porch steps, he grabbed me by my wrist and hauled me up without my feet touching the wood. He put me back down on the porch and grasped my shoulders tightly. He dropped his face to mine, his piercing gaze flaring with a ferocious intensity. You listen to me when I tell you to do something, boy. Then I got a hard clip over the ear. My ear went numb and rung with a high-pitched whir. My eyes swelled with tears. I looked at him, stunned. It was not the first time I'd been hit, but it was the first time I'd been hit over the head. Now, go to bed, right now, without supper. Without saying anything, I ran inside, up the steps, slammed my door, and curled under the covers. I buried my face into the pillow, and only then did I sob. I walked past the pylons that had remained for all these years. Some still stood, others had toppled over. They were old now, blackened with mold and weathered. The wood split and the carvings faded. I walked up the porch steps that moaned their old age. For a moment, I stood at the front door, tears stinging the back of my eyes. It was not the house I had come back for. It was what was in the field I needed to see. But it was the home I wanted to see, because through the bad memories, there was still some good. The hinges whined as I pushed the door open. The house was as I remembered, untouched from that last dreadful night I spent here all those years ago. The night we had to flee. Only now, the home was caked with dust and mold. Cobwebs had collected in the corners. The wallpaper had peeled in large sheets off the wall. All these artifacts of neglect and abandonment. The TV was still there, greyed with thick dust. Tears streamed down my face as I stood in the living room, the furniture standing around me like ruins. Every Sunday morning we would sit around there. I got to watch Looney Tunes on the TV as Dad would sit in his recliner reading the paper or a book, and Mum would make us her famous pancakes. No one could, or ever will, make them like Mum could. They were thick and fluffy, served with a generous drenching of maple syrup. If we were especially lucky, she would add chocolate chips to the batter and serve with a dollop of ice cream. That was the best. When she was done cooking, she would come through from the kitchen with 2 plates stacked high with pancakes. She would give one to Dad with a kiss, and one to me, with my own peck on the cheek. Then she would get her plate and join us in the living room. I would cuddle up next to her on the sofa, and we would sit together to enjoy her pancakes and watch cartoons. It was the one time during the week that everything did not feel so cold. The one time Dad did not feel so distant. The one time I was not scared of him. The one time he would actually have a conversation with Mom and me, instead of talking in short and simple bursts or barking out orders. The one time we were a real family. I wiped my tears with my sleeve and walked outside, leaving the home behind me for the last time. I waded out into the field, the soil hard beneath my boots. I could feel the field spirit. With some satisfaction, I felt it was weak. Dad had called it special. I would call it evil. The night Dad had sent me to bed with a clip over the ear and no supper, Mum had come up with some soup and a glass of soda. She handed it to me with a kiss on the forehead. "A mother can't let a child go hungry," she said. "It goes against all my nature." "Thanks, Mommy." "I know he's rough, Timmy, but try not to get too mad at him. He worries for you, that's all." "I don't care. I hate him." She sighed and looked away, then ruffled my hair and gave me a smile. "He does what he can to provide. Just leave the bowl and glass on the nightstand. I'll come in later and take it to the kitchen." She got up and walked to the door, pausing to say, "I love you." "Love you too, Mommy," I said, and she left the room. Later in the night, I had awoken suddenly. I sat bolt upright. My football. I left it outside that afternoon. It was my only ball, and it was just sitting out there, plain as day down in the driveway. If one of the older kids, the neighbours from a few miles down the road, saw it the next morning, they would surely steal it, if they had not already. And if they stole it, Dad would not buy me another. I could already hear his lecture in my head. "Let it be a lesson learned. If you don't take care of your things, they won't take care of you," he would always say. I creeped to my door, eased it open, and peeked around the corner to my parents' room down the hall. The door was shut, and the house dark and quiet. Perfect. I crept down the stairs and tiptoed to the kitchen, where Dad kept the front door keys in one of the drawers. I grabbed them, and then, dipping in and out of the moonlight that flooded through the windows, I tiptoed to the front door. I eased back the deadbolt as slowly and quietly as I could. They drew back with a faint click. I waited nervously after each one clicked back, listening for my parents' door to fly open with my father's heavy footsteps tumbling out like a madman. But they never came. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. My ball sat 15 yards away, looking lonely in the driveway. I was prepared to make a mad dash for it, run over, pick it up, run back, lock the doors, sneak back upstairs, and go to bed. Dad would be none the wiser. But before I could take off down the driveway, I was distracted by a rustling noise coming from the cornfield to my left. The cornstalks were about 6 foot by then, and shining a pale green under the moonlight. A man's muffled scream came from the corn. My heart leapt. The corn was restless. The stalks rustled back and forth in the center of the field, and then came another muffled scream. I froze, and my knees became watery. The scarecrows, they were not in their usual spots. They were closer together, in the center of the cornfield, their hooded heads poking out over the top of the stalks. And they were moving. The corn rustled violently, as did the scarecrows. They moved about wildly, as if they were wrestling with something. Another muffled scream. I watched on, wide-eyed and frozen with terror, as the scarecrows fought with something among the cornstalks. I thought that this was surely a bad dream. A terrible dream. A nightmare. And, in a sense, it was a nightmare. Just not the kind you can wake up from. The muffled scream cut off abruptly. The scarecrows froze for a moment, their hoods ruffling gently in the breeze. They craned their heads, and their straw faces, featureless, but somehow ingrained with hatred, settled on me. I was seeing something I should not be seeing. A shiver trickled down my spine. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, "Caw-caw, caw-caw, caw-caw, caw-caw." I was just about to scream when a hand grasped the back of my pajama collar and pulled me backwards into the house. I was flung to the ground by Dad. He stepped around me and slammed the door shut, then locked the 2 deadbolts. They drew shut with an emphatic shunk. I waited for Dad to turn around with a look of rage. But what I saw scared me worse. He had looked at me, not with rage, but terror. It was the first time I had seen him scared, and I would see him this scared only once more, just a few weeks later. I started to cry. Seeing him scared had scared me more than his rage ever could have. "It's okay," he said shakily. "You're okay to me." He bent down and scooped me up. He carried me to my room as I cried and tucked me into bed, saying one thing repeatedly. "You're okay to me. You're okay." A murder of crows flew overhead, moving strangely silent. I stood in the middle of the field, the once rich soil now sick. Up close, I could see it had taken on a greyish hue, and there was something else too. It was rumbling slightly, as if it were hungry. I readied my shovel and paused. I asked myself, do I really want to do this? What purpose did it serve? What would it change? Nothing. So, why had I come back? Closure. That was why. I could not move on if I did not have closure, nor could I heal. The nightmares would continue, the anxiety would persist, and my soul would continue to whittle and seep from wounds that wandering fingers of doubt kept prodding open. I had to see if it was all real. I could not let questions linger. Could such horror exist in this world? Or were my memories simply warped and exaggerated with time? So, did I want to do this? Yes. The answer was always yes. I should have come back years ago. Maybe then I would not have suffered so long. Closure. That is what I needed. I pierced the soil with my shovel. My door had burst open in the middle of the night. Dad was in the driveway, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "We need to go," he said. I sat up groggily. "What?" "We need to go." He pulled me out from under the blanket. "What's going on, Dad?" "We need to go." "Why?" He pulled me along at his side as we rushed down the stairs. His deep wrinkles and tanned skin, his strong jaw and sunken eyes, his pointed nose and thin lips, all twisted in an expression of terror. Terror, like what had plastered his face the night he had caught me outside after dark. Only worse. I started to cry. "Dad, where is Mum?" "I thought I did everything right," he said absently. "I don't know what I did wrong. The pylons, maybe?" The front door was already hanging open when he dragged me through it. Outside, the corn was restless again. "I don't know what I did wrong," Dad said. "I don't know how I didn't hear them come in." Dad dragged me to the pickup truck in the driveway. A woman's muffled screams came from the corn. I looked over my shoulder toward the field to see the hooded heads bobbing around wildly again. "Dad, where's Mom?" I said with increasing urgency. "I thought I did everything right. I don't know why it went wrong." He opened the pickup's passenger door and threw me inside. "Dad, where is Mom?" I screamed. He shut the door in my face. He walked around the front of the pickup, and for a moment he paused to look back at the field and the scarecrows. The shotgun trembled in his hands. For what it's worth, I think he would have tried to save her, if it were not for me. He continued around the car and climbed into the front seat. He fumbled with the keys in his trembling hands before inserting and turning them. The engine rumbled to life. "Dad, tell me, where's Mom?" He reversed suddenly, swinging the car around so the front end pointed down the driveway, away from the house. He slammed the stick into first gear and took off with a lurch. The dirt clattered the underneath of the truck as we went. "Where's Mom?" I cried, shrilly. He began to sob. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. I thought I did everything right. I'm sorry, Tim. I'm sorry, Sarah. Oh God, Sarah. I'm so sorry." I cowered back into my seat, feeling the car bounce over the bumpy road as we fled. My father cried, and so did I, as we drove off into the night, leaving the farm and Mom behind. I tossed aside the first clump of soil. Underneath the topsoil, the dirt was grey and pale as bone. I continued to dig, tossing the soil in a heap to the side, where it trembled subtly. Then I hit something with a hollow thud. I threw away the shovel and got to my knees. I reached into the hole and brushed aside the dirt. I uncovered what I expected, yet feared at the same time. A human skull. I pulled it from the dirt and held it up with shaking hands. The hollow eye sockets stared vacantly back at me. I put it aside and reached into the hole again. I clawed at the dirt frantically with my bare hands. There were more bones, skulls, hands, femurs. I poured and poured at the dirt. I dug until my fingernails were torn clean off. It was true. It was all true. There is evil in this world. My memories had not lied. I fell back on my ass, exhausted, terrified, despaired. A pile had formed around me. So many skulls, so many bones, all from the souls that had fed the soil. I shouldn't have been at school, but today was the only day that I was able to get things ready for the Meet the Teacher Day on Monday. When I pulled up to the school, what I saw was exactly what I expected. There were 2 other cars in the lot and a few workers outside working on some last-minute paint jobs to the front office. I waved to the workers as I walked into the office, swiping my card to open the door that leads onto the campus. It was weird being here while it was so quiet, but as I looked around, I noticed that a few things looked out of place. The sand on the playground wasn't raked as it usually was during school breaks. There were a few balls and toys littered around the field and the playground as well. There was a jacket abandoned at the bottom of the slide and half-eaten lunch on the picnic tables. I figured that maybe some of the staff who'd been coming in to prepare for Monday had brought their kids with them, which explained the toys, and maybe the lunch belonged to the cleaning crew, who hadn't gotten around to fixing up this area of the school. I shrugged it off and made my way to the 4th and 5th grade building, making my way down the hall to my classroom. As I made my way down the hallway, I noticed that a few of the classrooms had the lights on and the doors wide open. I peered into Mrs. Jenkins' room, looking around at the mess on the tables. Crayons, markers, glue, and scraps of paper covered the tables and the floor. And all of the chairs were pushed out as if someone had gotten up and left in a hurry. I had never known the cleaning crew to be this disorganized, but I kept walking down the hall, looking into some of the other classrooms, which were all just as messy. One particular room caught my eye. Mr. Blake's classroom. This one had sleeping bags and cots all over the room, and all of the tables, chairs and shelves had been taken out of the room to make space for them. As I finally reached my classroom, I stopped to look at the new decorations on the wall across the hall. There was a square portion of it that had been covered in blue paper with a banner that read, "What we did this summer," over it. Below that, there were dozens of pictures of the children. There were dates beside each row of pictures, going as far back as the last week of school, and including every week of summer break as well. I scanned each of the photographs, noticing how as time progressed, the children looked more sad, disheveled and sick. The most recent row contained pictures from last week, with only about 15 kids in the photographs, as opposed to the 30 or so kids that were pictured at the start of the summer. There were only 2 teachers that I recognized in the pictures, and they seemed to be the only staff who was anywhere near the campus throughout this time. Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Blake. That explained why their classroom seemed to be the messiest, but why were these kids here for the entire summer? I hadn't heard anything about the school providing summer school classes that lasted this long. "Miss Cole!" I jumped as I turned in the direction of the sudden voice to see Ryan Edwards running down the hall towards me. "Ryan?" I asked. He had been one of my best students last year, and he was moving on to 5th grade, which meant he would still be in the same building for another year. He glanced behind him, looking nervous. He stopped in front of me, doubled over and out of breath. "What's going on?" I asked, looking behind him as well. There was no one there. "You shouldn't be here," he said, panting. "What do you mean?" I asked. I looked at him, noticing that his face was covered in dirt, and he had bruises and scrapes on his arms and legs. The sole of one of his sneakers was loose, making the front of his shoe gape open. He smelled like he hadn't showered for the whole summer and looked like he had lost about 10 pounds. "They didn't... I don't know what... all the kids..." he gasped. "Okay, alright Ryan, I need you to slow down. Just take a few deep breaths and then tell me what's going on." I watched as he closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths. "Okay?" I asked. He nodded. "They wouldn't let us leave. Mr. Blake and Mrs. J, they kept us locked up in the assembly room for a lot of days. They just left us alone and we couldn't get out. When they came back, they told us we couldn't leave. They said it was summer camp or something, but they didn't let us call our parents or anything. Some of the kids disappear every few days, and no one knows what happens to them. We need... Well, we need to call the police," I said. "No," he shouted. "You can't. They won't help. It isn't the real Mr. Blake or Mrs. J. I don't know what they are, but it isn't them. They have some kind of powers. We tried to ask the cleaning people for help. Well, Jessie did. She speaks Spanish. But they did something, and the cleaning people just ignored us, even when Mr. Blake hit her." I stood there, horrified, staring at Ryan. "All right, well then we need to get out of here," I said. I started walking back down the hall, but Ryan grabbed my arm. "No, not that way. They were chasing me from that way. We need to go out a window." "What?" I asked. "Ryan, are you in here?" I heard a distorted voice call. "Hurry!" Ryan hissed. I pulled him into my classroom with me, and we made our way to one of the back windows. I opened it and helped him climb out at first. I could hear footsteps coming down the hallway. "Ryan, you won't be able to get away," the voice said. It didn't sound at all familiar. It was in a weird pitch and almost robotic. I climbed out of the window and grabbed Ryan, running around the building. "Where should we go?" I asked. "I don't know," Ryan cried, looking around. "Well, what about the library?" I asked. "No, that's where the parents are. I don't think you want to go in there." "What?" "The parents. They're all in there," Ryan repeated. "Well, shouldn't we let them out?" I asked. "They're all dead," he said. "What? How?" "They did it. Mr. Blake and Mrs. J. Except not them, because that isn't them back there." I glanced at the library. "All right, so where are we going then?" I asked. Ryan looked around. "The cafeteria," he shouted, pointing. I grabbed his hand and we ran across the grass. I reached for the door, praying that it would open, and sighing in relief when it swung open. We stepped in, and I closed the door behind us, moving 2 chairs underneath the door handles to jam it shut. I looked around at the empty cafeteria. This appeared to be one of the only places that they hadn't messed up somehow, which made sense, considering that Ryan looked like he hadn't eaten the entire time he was here. "Where are the rest of the kids?" I asked. "I don't know. They split us up. That's how I got away. They were moving us to the junior high building," he said. "I'm going to block the other doors. Stay here," I said to him. He nodded, and I walked to the other side of the room, checking to see if those doors were open as well. They were locked, but I moved the table in front of it just to be safe, and then made my way into the kitchen. I checked the doors back there, and they too were locked. Next, I made my way to the restrooms. I walked into the women's restroom first, walking to the far right stall to close the window at the top of that wall. I walked into the men's room next, and opened the same stall to check that window. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me. I gagged as I used my shirt to cover my nose. I stepped back a bit before walking into the stall and coming face to face with the source of the smell. It was a dead body. More specifically, Ryan's dead body. It appeared to have been dead for a few days at least. I froze as I stared at it, confused and scared. If Ryan was in here, dead, then who? Miss Cole? I heard a voice calling. I stepped out of the stall and slowly opened the door, stepping out into the small hallway. As I slowly shut the door behind me, the lights went out. Miss Cole? I walked over to the kitchen again, ducking behind one of the counters. I'm gonna get you, Miss Cole. I hid in a storage closet and called the police, but they seem to think this is some kind of prank and warned me not to call again. My phone's battery is about to die, even though I'm fairly certain it was fully charged when I left the house this morning. Ryan, or whatever it is that's pretending to be Ryan, is still out there. But he doesn't seem to be coming after me, and instead is waiting for me to go to him. I don't know if he knows that I've figured it out, but I don't want to take my chances. I think I might die here. Or worse, I'll become one of them. Whatever they are. I suffer from social anxiety just a bit more than you might expect, even for a typically introverted engineering student. So last summer, after my freshman year, I avoided opportunities for internships in people-dense environments like the giant aerospace employers, and instead, I did an internship with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources at a state park. It was a non-academic internship, since my major is computational engineering, not forestry. But it still paid $13 an hour and gave me something to do for the summer. Plus, the idea of being outdoors sounded good to me. Hopefully next year I can intern at a small company, maybe the kind of research firm where you get to work a lot independently. Most of the work was what you'd expect: trail maintenance, emptying trash cans, cleaning up after campers, and so on. But for 1 week towards the end of summer, I got assigned to a small team to help collect data as part of some forest management project. Each day, I would get a list of GPS coordinates to hike to and take some measurements using a kit of instruments the DNS people provided: soil samplers, a logger's tape to determine tree diameter breast height, and so on. Easy stuff. The interns who are forestry majors were given a few additional tools like densitometers to estimate tree spacing and look for canopy thinning. I was also given a small handheld electronic device with an LCD display and some lights and switches on it. It didn't look too different from a sound meter or an ohm meter, but there were no unit markings or labels, so I couldn't really tell what it was supposed to measure. I was just told to turn it on at each GPS location on my list, wait for the green light to come on, and write down the digital readouts. One of the other interns thought it was an air sampling tool, maybe for checking pollen or pollution levels. We were dropped off in pairs along a service road that cut through the forest. I was teamed with a girl named Janine, a forestry major who I'd worked with once or twice before. The GPS coordinates on our list formed a clockwise loop about 6 miles long, with our drop-off/pickup location being the northernmost point of the loop. We had backpacks with bottled waters and our lunches in them, as trekking 6 miles through fairly dense forest was going to take much of the day. We also had a long-range walkie-talkie for emergencies. Our fifth coordinate took us south into what was marked on our map as a protected wilderness area, off limits to the public to minimize human disturbance. The trees here were older and larger, and maybe a bit further spaced apart in the area we had just left. The terrain was rougher, with lots of small hillocks and gullies, and a lot of undergrowth and dead fall. Janine told me that, before the settlers came to Ohio, a squirrel could cross the state from one side to the other without touching the ground, but the settlers had since cut down almost everything. There were only a dozen or so original old-growth forest areas remaining in Ohio, like the one we are in now, untouched by human hand, except for maybe the Shawnee and their prehistoric ancestors. I was deep in thought on our way to the 6th coordinate, close to the southernmost part of the loop, contemplating just how unchanged this area must have been for who knows how many thousands of years, maybe even since the end of the last ice age. As we worked our way through a particularly dense section of the underbrush, beneath massive oak trees, it seemed to me that an ancient and timeless feeling hung heavy in the air. I can imagine the first Native Americans crossing through this forest many thousands of years ago, finding it much like it was now. Then, as the underbrush gave way to a small clearing, there stood an intercom box, mounted on a post. For a moment, Janine and I just stared at it, neither one of us moving or speaking. It was certainly jarring to come across such a man-made device in this particular context, immediately violating the primeval feeling of the forest. Then, I began mentally seeking to rationalize the box's existence here. Perhaps, after all, it was just part of some communication system or emergency call box for fire lookout parties. The call box and the post looked old, with red paint flaking off and rust showing through. The box itself was rectangular, with a speaker grill and a single round button that had probably been beige or white at one point, but had yellowed badly. On the back of the box was a logo of some kind, faded almost to the point of illegibility, but I could discern a large J2 in a retro-futuristic looking font that might have come from the 1950s, superimposed over some kind of spiral pattern. The bottom edges of the box were badly corroded, all the way through in places. The post was square in cross-section and anchored into a cracked and discolored concrete pad about 2 feet across. With a glance at Janine, I pushed the button. Nothing happened. Not even a crackle of static or anything. Janine pushed it a couple of times too, and said, "Hello? Hello?" But there was no response. We shared our speculations about what the box might be for as we continued on our route. But something interesting did happen at our 6th coordinate, which was another couple of 100 yards or so past the intercom. When I turned on the electronic measuring device, it made clicking sounds like a Geiger counter, and the numbers on the digital readout were more than twice as high as any of our previous measurements had been. I aimed it in different directions, but the numbers stayed the same. Apparently the device was not directional. So I walked 100 feet further west and tried again, then came back to the coordinate and walked 100 feet south. Janine caught on to what I was doing and started writing down the numbers as I tried different directions. Pretty soon we had established that the numbers were increasing most rapidly as we moved in a south-southwestern direction. I looked at Janine questioningly, and she nodded her agreement. We continued in that direction, pausing every couple 100 feet to check the readings and see if we were still heading towards the increasing numbers. As the numbers climbed, the clicks blended together into a low buzz, which rose in pitch until it was more the kind of squeal you get from a metal detector passing over buried coins. The forest was completely silent, and the light started to get weird in some subtle way. We soon found ourselves occasionally losing our balance and stumbling, One minute we would descend a rise that would seem to pull us along as if we were going downhill. The next minute, we would suddenly have to lean sideways or forward to keep on our feet. I pulled the logger's tape from the DNS kit and dangled it like a plumb bob to confirm that the local gravity vector kept randomly changing by as much as 15 degrees or so, depending on where you stood. After we had gone roughly a half mile from the 6th coordinate, the electronic device didn't make any more squealing sound, but the light came on red instead of green, and the numbers on the readouts were flashing. By now, there was also an electric feeling in the air. Janine had visible goosebumps, and my hair felt like it was standing up. Sounds had taken on a thin, tinny quality, as if they were being filtered through an antique phonograph speaker. "I'm getting very uncomfortable with this," I told Janine. "Maybe we should get back on our route." "Don't you want to know what's going on here?" she asked. "We can't stop now. We must be close to whatever is causing all this." "Whatever is causing all this seems to be bending the rules of physics. We have no idea if it's safe. There could be radiation or who knows what. This is far from normal." "How about a compromise?" she offered. "We can go west for a few hundred yards, and then, if we don't find anything, we can loop back north to our next coordinate." It turns out we didn't have to go more than another 100 yards before we could make out a large hill through the trees. As we approached, it resolved into a large, perfectly conical-shaped mound, rising roughly 50 feet from the forest floor and maybe 150 feet across. The forest continued unabated, right up to the top of the mound. And although the trees looked a bit sickly and were fewer and farther apart, they were mature oaks, suggesting that the mound had been here for at least a couple hundred years. But as we circled the mound to the south and back around the other side, we came upon a set of metal blast doors set in the side of the mountain, about a third of the way up. The call doors had the same J2 spiral pattern logo on it as the call box, along with a large and faded warning sign declaring this a restricted area. Do not approach or enter. The doors had no visible handle, and in any event looked too massive to lift open. As we stood there, looking, the ground started buzzing and the undergrowth vibrating. Suddenly, we were pulled forward by another shifting gravity, this one much stronger than before. I found myself falling face first into the mound, and to my right, Janine had landed on the doors. Instantly, the buzzing stopped. I stood back up, but Janine still leaned heavily forward with both hands against the door. She slowly turned her head with this freaky, vacant look on her face. Her eyes were completely unfocused, and, I kid you not, both were tracking in different directions, and said, We wish harmony with you." Only it was not the sound of her own voice coming out of her mouth. It was as if 1,000 different people were whispering the same thing at once, perfectly synchronized. I want unity with you. Join us. Join me." I shouted at her, got right up to her ear and yelled, "Janine!" But she did not seem to notice. We wish synthesis with you." I grabbed her backpack and tugged hard, pulling her off the door. We both stumbled backwards onto the ground. She sat with that vacant look on her face for a few more seconds. Then it was as if she suddenly woke up. She screamed, and the look of sheer maddening terror on her face is something I will never forget. The ground began buzzing again, and the door with it. We are many, we are one. Merge with us, with me, unite with me, with us, was the call of 1,000 voices from the vibrations of the door. Janine, still screaming, shot up and bolted through the forest. I followed, calling after her. She ran without looking, careening off of trees, with undergrowth whipping against her. Finally, she was tripped up, and she lay on the ground crying as I caught up to her. After she caught her breath and stopped crying, I asked her what had just happened. But she kept shaking her head, saying, No. I managed to get her to her feet and plotted a course pretty much straight towards our rendezvous point. I tried the walkie-talkie, but the reply was 1,000 whispers. Come, join us. Me. Us. And quickly turned it off before Janine could hear. Then we passed another call box, and I heard faint whispers emanating from it. So I steered Janine away. After another mile, the radio seemed to work okay. I told them Janine had taken a tumble in the underbrush and sprained her ankle, so we were aborting the rest of our coordinates and needed picking up early. I had not written down the digital readout of the 6th coordinate, and we had not recorded any data since. So there was no evidence that anything out of the norm had happened, which was fine by me, and I assumed would be fine with Janine as well. I did not see her again after that day, and upon asking around, I was told she had returned to school a couple weeks early for some sorority activities. That was last summer. This summer, I interned at a small research firm and assumed I would never talk to Janine again. We'd only interacted just the 2 or 3 times after all. But last week, I got a voicemail from her. I need to talk to you about what happened to me, to us. We should meet soon. Call us, me, us. Let us know when you can join us. I don't know how she even got my number, as it's unlisted. But I don't think I'll call her back. When my daughter, Gracie, was accepted into college, I was filled with equal parts elation and trepidation. She was at an age where I knew that I had to let her go and live her own life. But deep down, I never got over her leaving. I don't think any parent ever does. Thankfully, we kept in regular contact through Skype sessions, texts, and phone calls. It was during this time that my eyes were opened to the wonders of technology. Despite the miles of distance between us, sometimes it felt that she'd never left. As you can imagine, I was more than happy to have her home for the holidays. I couldn't wait to hear all about her college experiences, how she was settling in, and just to see her outside a screen. I'm almost at the bus terminal, Dad, she chuckled, the shuffle of luggage breaking over the line. Stop worrying. It's my civic duty as a parent to worry, I snorted. I can almost see her rolling her eyes at that tired old statement. Not when their kids are old enough to know not to do stupid things. Oh, believe me, I did plenty of stupid things in college. Her laugh crackled into my ear. Yeah, I bet you did. Like car surfing or unironically listening to Wham. Suddenly, all sound cut off, even the muted echo of her footsteps. I thought the signal had been lost, until I heard her prolonged, quiet breaths. There was a flutter of anxiety in me. Gracie? I heard her utter a muffled, "What the hell?" under her breath. The flutter surged up into a tidal wave. Gracie, honey, are you okay? Yeah, Dad, I'm fine. I just saw this really weird guy. I found myself leaning forward where I was sitting, my heart in my mouth. Every nightmare scenario I'd ever had regarding those words flashed through my mind with unremitting speed. Gracie, did he talk to you? Try anything? God, no. He was just standing there under a streetlight, not moving. He was huge, the biggest guy I've ever seen. He was wearing like this big overcoat. I didn't see his face. His back was turned to the wall. He's taking a pee or drunk or something. He looks wet, like he's been walking in the rain. Just keep walking and don't make eye contact, I told her. You don't have to tell me twice, she scoffed. The next few minutes of banal conversation helped me ease out of the panicked parent mode, but the lump in my throat never subsided. Gracie just kept chatting about her campus life without missing a beat. She had an amazing ability to just let things slide off her back, just like her mother had done, and how I couldn't. Some might have called it overprotectiveness, but I just wanted her home more than ever. Honestly, I'm just dreading the results of the finals. I think I did okay in all the others, but political science is where I crashed and burned. I mean, I tried, but it was all another language to me. Gracie, you're overthinking things. I know you did great in all of them. Dad, I appreciate your confidence, but it's not going to help me pass this semester. It was just so good to hear her voice again after a long day that I barely noticed how her breathing became more hurried and footsteps taking up a quicker pace. I soon picked up on the sudden waver in her tone when she spoke. Dad, what bus am I getting again? I quirked an eyebrow at this, a slight alarm growing. Gracie was usually more organised than I was. The 8:15. Why? Are you sure that there's no earlier buses? What? You really in that much of a rush to get back home? I joked. Just check, she snapped, before her voice slipped back into a more pleasing tone. Please, Dad, just check online. It was then when I realised it wasn't just simple impatience. Something was terribly wrong. Gracie, what's wrong? Dad, she swallowed. It's the guy from before. He's back. I think he's following me. The aura of normality evaporated around me, replaced with a barely restrained terror. It was a moment from my wildest nightmares, now playing out in front of me. I think he's been following me since I saw him at the streetlight, she breathed. I don't know how he managed to catch up so fast with me. Just keep walking, I told her, trying to keep my own terror out of my voice. Don't look at him. Stick to the areas where there's light and people. If he tries anything, you can scream for help. Keep the police on speed dial. I was trying to keep her calm, but I was a mess. Even as I said that, it was already past closing time for a lot of businesses in that city. It could have just been a random drunk wandering around in the dead of night, but I wasn't about to take the chance. I was just praying for her to find somewhere safe before anything could happen. Okay, she choked back another panicked breath. Where is he, Gracie? He's on the other side of the street. He's walking at the same pace as mine, and he's just staring at me. He's not even blinking or anything. There were a few more minutes of tepid breathing before a scream exploded in my ear. Damn! I heard her fumble with the phone, almost dropping it to the ground. Her jogging pace had turned into a full-on running. Gracie, please, what's happening? He's on the same street as me now. I don't know how. I didn't even see him move. What the hell? His face is all wrong. His eyes are too small, and his mouth's too big. His skin looks like it's made out of wax. He just keeps staring at me. She inhaled, her voice dropping to a whisper. He's just a few feet behind me now. I don't know what he wants. Please, Dad, I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. Her voice cracked on the last word, morphing into hyperventilating sobs that sounded like she was struggling to even breathe. My own tears softened my eyes at the sound of my daughter crying. I'd never heard her so terrified in her life, not even as a child. My whole body ached to be there with her, to protect her from whatever was following her. I repeated the mantra over in my mind. Please, God, let her get that bus. Let her get home alive. I'm here, Gracie. Stay in the line with me. Just keep walking. Don't let him know where you're headed. She hiccuped before taking another sharp breath. Her feet took up a faster pace. I knew that he was after her. I admit that neither of us were thinking straight in that moment, both too caught up in our own terror. I'd never felt so helpless in my life listening to her. Call the police! Call the police! I yelled into the receiver. But all I heard back was the low crackle of static. There was a clunking as Gracie lowered the phone. My heart froze, thinking she'd ended the conversation, until I heard her yell at her pursuer. I've called the police. I'm on the phone right now with them. They know where you are. After more tense silence, my daughter let out a nervous laugh. Gracie? He's gone, Dad. I think that I lost him. We found ourselves both exhaling almost simultaneously in relief, the aftershocks still ebbing through our adrenaline-fueled systems. Where are you now? She sucked air through her teeth. Outside a coffee shop. There's light and people inside, just enough to notice. I sank my head into my outstretched palm. Thank God, I murmured. How far is the bus terminal? I can see the lights. It's just up ahead. God, I was so scared. I really thought he was going to kill me. Gracie? Gracie, baby, please speak to me. Dad? It was the way she spoke, that innocuous little word, one that usually filled me with warmth, that plunged me into icy fear. He's looking at me from behind an alley. I don't know how he's here. I ran 2 blocks. His neck's bent over his shoulder, almost upside down, like it's broken or something. Jesus Christ. This was followed by a series of crunching movements, and my daughter's stifled, half-sobbing gasp. It was then that she said something that will haunt me to my dying day. Dad, it's not a coat. It's a mouth. It was the only coherent sentence I heard before it was swallowed up by her garbled screams, intermixed with low growls, not unlike those of a dog, and slapping and moist tearing sounds, like a sharpened knife carving through raw meat. The cacophony subsided into barely audible breaths before a deeper voice rumbled into my ear. "Good," it croaked out between wet mouthfuls. "So good." The words were swallowed up by a fit of screeching cackles and babbling, reaching a ringing pitch far beyond what any human was capable of. Then the line went dead. I sat there in silence, my throat red raw from screaming my daughter's name into the receiver, and the phone threatening to clatter to the floor with how much my hands were shaking before my fingers finally fumbled to call 911. I'm not sure how I managed to explain what had just happened in such a state when I could barely comprehend it. The police tracked the signal to outside the same coffee shop she'd stopped at. They found her phone scattered amidst the garbage. Her call history revealed she tried to dial the police 3 times. There was no trace of my daughter or the man who'd followed her that night, aside from the clumped strands of her long, dark hair soaked in some transparent, viscous material. Forensics tested it and found it to be saliva from some indeterminable source. Gracie became just another missing person, her smiling photograph forever frozen in time and plastered across walls, with her general information and a bold phone number beneath, waiting for a tip that never came. Despite her case being officially open, her disappearance was soon hushed up to become the stuff of urban legend and rumour. Every word of that phone call is still burned into my memory. I live every day with my own replies still ghosting on my lips, tinged with regret, and wondering what I could have done to stop it. I still leave the porch light out of the dimming hope that one day she might come home. But deep down, I know that will never happen outside my own imagination. Just thinking about it tears into my very soul. But the truth is, my little girl is gone. If you're out on the streets at night, I'd advise you to be aware of your surroundings. Take a friend or 2 with you. And above all, don't go alone. There is something out there. And it's hungry. We've probably all experienced it, the mysterious phantom buzz. After reaching into our pockets to see who messaged or texted us, the screen shows no activity. Then we unlock our phones and confirm what we already knew. No one contacted us, and yet we definitely felt the familiar pulsation of a phone notification against our thigh. Some might chalk it up to the very quirky nature of electronic devices. Others may think the phantom vibrations are just due to the overactive imagination of the digital generation. Have you ever wondered what causes it? A research group in the south of England conducted a series of experiments to see if they could figure out what was behind the phenomenon. They examined the many properties of electromagnetic waves, Bluetooth interference, and even the offhand possibility of sunspot activity being the cause. Nothing scientifically obvious could be linked to the familiar, disquieting sensation. They even considered the possibility of it being psychological based, but came up empty-handed. It was deemed to be too widespread to be an imaginary affliction shared by so many. With the volunteers sitting around waiting for it to occur, it tended to render all the research data void. Trying to force these unpredictable experiences to take place on cue was no way to conduct a valid, peer-based study. The subjects were encouraged to be completely honest and objective. They were only to report incidents of real phantom buzz experiences. Reinforcing that maxim would hopefully cut down drastically on the number of false positives. In the specific testing world, there are always a number of volunteers who are so anxious to help that they over-report things, all to have more personal impact on the study. The researchers wanted to ensure there were no rewards or incentives to offer false testimony. Participants received the same stipend whether they reported 15 incidents or none. After running down a long list of potential causes and eliminating all of them, the researchers began to entertain less conventional, highly unorthodox ideas. They recorded the appropriate time and location of each event for cross-examination. Researchers scoured the internet for possible connections but made little headway until a fledgling researcher stumbled upon a very curious coincidence. On a number of the phantom buzz incidents, there was corresponding data in a very unlikely place: the city morgue. Official reports showed the time of death for a number of individuals inside the city limits to be within 2 minutes of the buzz phenomenon. The young researcher didn't know what to do with the information. She wanted to be taken seriously by her superiors, but they had encouraged everyone to share all anomalies, no matter how coincidental. At the morning meeting, she elected to approach the subject with levity. Before anyone recommends that I join the psychic hotline, I just want to point out that what I'm about to say is purely in the spirit of full disclosure. I've noticed that a significant number of the phantom buzz events roughly correspond with death records at the Metropolitan Morgue. A number of her peers grinned at a cheeky pun. It was a very clever way of introducing questionable and highly unscientific ideas to the meeting. Before the crowd could turn on her, she quickly added, "I'm not saying Grandma is trying to text our volunteers one last time. I'm only reporting a significant number of time crossovers to the events. I'll let our esteemed members decide what to do, if anything, with the data." Several of the esteemed scientists laughed at the preposterous idea. The young researcher instantly regretted divulging the psychic connection, but one of the lead researchers in the team stood up for her. People, we asked for our team members to bring us everything. Everything. That's what Miss Thorne has done. When all of the obvious things fail to line up, you look at what is left. That's the scientific way. There could be a logical explanation for these unusual tie-ins she has uncovered. Let's try to keep an open mind, shall we? Astrid was very grateful for the authoritative reprieve. She wasn't looking forward to being teased mercilessly by her peers. A mid-level researcher on the team came to a desk to collect the data. What might have otherwise been tossed in the rubbish bin was actually treated with some level of consideration. It was refreshing to be supported for a change. What the next level researchers found was a bit more disconcerting. By expanding search parameters to include deaths from nearby towns and cities, the number of linkable events skyrocketed. The scientific purists among the team were deeply offended that anyone in their field would try to draw a connection between those seemingly disparate things. They dismissed the aligned events as pure coincidence. After all, people died all the time. It didn't take much to fuse the two unrelated things if you tried hard enough. Another more open-minded group within the team found the potential connection compelling. They didn't believe in a supernatural aspect, but suspected there could be a logical explanation. Over time, they were able to tie a large majority of the events with nearby deaths. It was enough to see a possible connection, but not enough to know what it might mean. One of the volunteers reported a new phantom buzz on their iPhone, and the team sprang into action. It was the first such incident after the controversial new theory had been put forth. 2 hours passed before the next official medical report was filed. It placed the time of death at the exact same minute as the most recent phantom buzz incident. Tongues started wagging as each new report seemed to reinforce the disturbing connection more. Meanwhile, the hardcore doubters on the staff grew increasingly irate. The whole research team was becoming completely polarized as the study continued. A cellular network expert was brought in to shine some light on the bizarre proceedings. Data collected from area mobile service providers did show compelling evidence of an unknown energy source disrupting their network coverage. Tower data showed an immediate, unexplained pulse after each of the official death reports. The phantom pulses were overlooked by the service providers because they did not damage any equipment and were not associated with known mobile transmissions. After the network specialists were brought up to speed, they were able to trace the vector of the unknown signals. They confirmed that in all tested cases, they originated from the nearest tower to the deceased, and then went directly to the volunteer's mobile phone. It was a huge scientific milestone. Quantifiable proof now existed of a possible link between the passing of an individual and the odd sensation that manifested itself through their electronic phones. The sensation itself was real. Unknown signals really did buzz individuals for unknown reasons. Proving there was a direct link between the pulses and the death of a nearby human being was going to be a far more difficult task. Even the most outspoken critics of the idea began to backpedal slightly as each new revelation was brought to light. With it proven empirically that unknown signals were emitting from cell towers and travelling to the cell phones in question, it was hard to deny. Even the most atheistic members of the science community accepted that some form of energy was contained within the human body. It made sense that whatever that life force was, it left the body at the final moment of death. These skeptics adjusted their focus from denial of the possibility to theories of why the phantom buzz occurred at all. They weren't ready to entertain superstitious notions that the dead was trying to communicate with the living through radio frequencies. They pursued a running theory that human life force is inanimate and is accidentally captured by the cellular band waves. That they were willing to accept as possible, but even that was a bit of a stretch to them. The study itself had already been an unprecedented success. They had proven that the phantom buzz experienced by tens of millions of people worldwide isn't imaginary. It is a real, psychological reaction to an unknown pulse of energy pinging their phones. As exciting as it was to discover, it opened up a whole new can of worms. What was the source of the rogue signals? Were they deliberate messages sent by the newly dead? Or was it just a coincidental, involuntary aspect of the dying process? Documented deaths near the towers at the same moment the signals were sent was compelling, but no proof of deliberate act of communication. Were these mysterious bursts of energy valid proof of the life force leaving the bodies of the dead, or was it just a coincidence too? The greater question was whether it was a deliberate attempt by the dead to communicate through the use of modern electronics. Many believe the phenomenon was just random energy being magnetically drawn to the nearby cellular technology. It would be a monumental task to prove or disprove either theory. Are there any biological or family links between those who have died and the recipients of the phantom signals? One member of the team inquired. No one had been able to connect any of the deceased to the living. Even if there were a handful of familial connections between the two ends of the transmission, it seemed highly unlikely that they would all be. If not, it casts significant doubt on why the recent departed would wish to communicate with a total stranger. What else do we know about these phantom signals? One of the lead researchers wanted to know. No matter how insignificant it might seem, it could prove helpful in our investigation. A young man named Nathan Tolley spoke up near the back of the room. Our disgruntled ghosts prefer to use older CDMA technology, it would appear, he offered. There was a brief, uncomfortable pause in the conference room, followed by a chorus of nervous snickers. The lead researcher raised an eyebrow and asked him for clarification. Between the GSM and the CDMA cellular phone networks, we've documented almost twice as many phantom signals sent to owners of CDMA-based cellular phones. I don't know what that means specifically, but the ratio is significant in my opinion. If one was slightly more frequent than the other, it would be irrelevant. But a 2-to-1 ratio is noteworthy. Depending on whom you ask, CDMA is older and arguably a more limited technology. The leader of the meeting thanked Nate for his astute observation and made a mental note to look into the technological differences. Then he addressed the audience again. Has anyone prepared a chart of known personal details about the recently deceased? We need to compare gender, the type of phone network contacted, and so forth. For all we know, CDMA signals may always correspond with recently deceased gentlemen, whereas the GSM signals may always connect with the ladies who have passed. Maybe it's gender specific, or a preferential wavelength associated with unique radio frequency factors. I don't know what the answer is to this mystery. I'm not sure we will ever find out the full truth, but I hope we can uncover more of the stunning details. Nate spoke up again. Since we've reached the point where we accept that the phantom signals originate from cell towers, perhaps we should expand our scope of experts. They have no natural origin that we can trace, correct? We've been working under the uncomfortable assumption that somehow it is an unknown link to the recently deceased. I realize that is anathema to science, but we aren't far from admitting that hypothesis. Why not bring a paranormal expert to offer another viewpoint? A large group of the team gasped in unison. Parapsychology was the academic equivalent of consulting a fortune teller to many purists. It still wasn't a very respected branch of research in most scientific circles. The murmur of the crowd increased in volume until the meeting leader tapped a pencil on the table. I would be the last person here to entertain an audience of clairvoyants or soothsayers normally, but this project has taken us into uncharted territory. The best researchers go where the research takes them, no matter what. Perhaps Mr. Tolley is correct to suggest that we consider a different approach. We've taken this project about as far as it can go with traditional methods. I'll speak with some experts at the university to see if they can recommend a suitable addition to our diverse team. I expect that everyone here will treat them with the utmost respect. The following Monday morning, a respected paranormal investigator was introduced to the research team. Her welcome was cordial, but understandably stiff. The majority of the research scientists have already had some preconceived notions about her chosen field and were not going to be easily swayed. Shay expected the cold shoulder and did what she could to reassure them she wasn't going to bring in voodoo dolls and astrological charts. Eventually, Astrid, Nate, and a few other members of the staff warmed to her. Shay read over the team's research progress with enthusiasm. It wasn't every day that a traditional scientific study uncovered evidence of credible paranormal activity. She was secretly excited to be involved with such groundbreaking research. With hard work and determination, Shay hoped to win over the skeptics and play a significant part in the pioneering experiments. On the first day of her inclusion, Shay was present as the volunteers awaited one of the mysterious signals. In typical fashion, the act of waiting for something seemed to have the agonizing effect of prolonging its arrival. Hours passed as the team and volunteers waited for another phantom buzz. As a gifted psychic medium, she was expected to run over and feel any phone that went off for possible lingering traces of the unknown sender. Her skeptics scoffed at the idea of there being valid feedback from touching an object, but she quickly silenced them. The first incident occurred after almost 7 hours of inactivity. She held the volunteer's cell phone in her palm and focused after he reported the unexplained sensation. Shay was a little nervous as the room full of doubting science geeks observed her psychic skills for the first time. The sender of the transmission to this mobile phone was named Helen McTavish. She passed away a few moments ago after a long illness. I sense that she is lost and unsure of what to do. Frankly, she's terrified. 30 mouths dropped open in simultaneous shock. Her description was so vivid and specific. It wasn't even close to the vague generalities that they expected from an avowed psychic and medium. Normally, the paranormal readings given in these circumstances are about as specific as a newspaper horoscope. Instead, Shay had offered details that were easily verifiable or refutable. It was a refreshing level of opacity in a field ordinarily known for its mystique. 2 hours later, the morgue report came in and verified everything Shay had claimed about the deceased. Everyone present knew that she had no way of knowing those facts about the victim in advance. If that didn't make a believer out of the hardcore skeptics, then her similar accuracy with the next couple of incidents certainly did. She had a natural gift that was impossible to deny. Over the next couple days, she predicted the discovery of several more departed individuals from the phantom signals. While scientists were engaged in the difficult task of theorizing how the dead were able to tap into the cellular bandwidth, psychologists on the team were troubled with the question of why. The leader of the morning meeting discussed the latest progress and theories. There was a call for input from the team members. Nate raised his hand. "This isn't primary school, Mr. Tolley. Just speak your mind." Nate sheepishly lowered his hand and spoke. "We've spent so much time proving the link between the recently departed and these phantom signals that we seem to have neglected a more important question. That being, why are these restless souls contacting strangers? Do they want to unburden their sins like a last confession? Wouldn't they rather communicate with their loved ones? Unless it's like an unmanned telephone switchboard where there is no choice with whom they are connected. It doesn't make any sense why they have been reaching out to total strangers. Also, this phenomenon has never resulted in any two-way contact. I think we need to focus more on those areas of thought." Very valid points, Nate. Perhaps Miss Grafton can offer more insight on these pertinent questions. She is our very gifted paranormal expert after all. Shay, what do you say? She was greatly startled at being put on the spot. It was a sensitive area she had been trying to avoid. But the moment had finally arrived. There was no longer any more putting off the chilling truth. Your earlier observation about the strangeness of their transmissions always coming to total strangers is a very valid one, she began in earnest. They aren't hoping to communicate with any of us. They're trying, unsuccessfully so far, to find a way to trade places with the living. It's only a matter of time.